Back. If any of you are here for the first time, the first session at the conference, welcome. Otherwise, I suspect most of you have been here from the beginning. My name is Leonard Hawes. My task this afternoon is to introduce two enormously interesting speakers, if only judged from the abstracts that they've submitted. And I'm sure from the title in the program that you're anticipating their presentations as much as I am. I realize that this is I feel like I'm in a bit of a dilemma because staying on track means we should get going here pretty soon, and it's 10 after 2, and I want to have enough time to have a healthy Q&A session. On the other hand, I hate to start before everybody's back, so I've waited 10 minutes and I think I'll begin now. This afternoon, you're going to have the advantage of thinking along with two very bright, very experienced men who I think have different and in some ways, if I'm a judge of it, complementary things to tell us. I'm not going to say any more other than to introduce them because they deserve all of the time. Our first presenter is from the University of Utah, the Middle East Center, Abdul Qayyum Mohammad. The title of his address is Islamic Approach to Conflict Resolution. And I suspect we will learn something both about the Quran and about conflict resolution. Professor Mohammad.
Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present a few words, and thank you all for coming. The title, as been stated, is Islamic Theory of Conflict Resolution, or the Islamic Approach to Conflict Resolution. When we talk about conflict, we usually refer to an armed struggle or clash between opposing parties, either within the boundaries of a state or a society or outside the boundaries, to achieve political, military, and/or economic objectives. More than often, these tensions and conflicts are the result of social, economic, and political inequalities. Therefore, the Islamic approach to conflict resolution in this study is guided and based on Islam's main principles of equality, just social order, and justice and peace. First, I'm going to investigate the sources in the Quran, or the Quran is the main source. What are the references in the Quran that refers to conflict resolutions? And thereafter, I will investigate the hadith of the saying of the Prophet. And then there will be two important treaties or documents. It's called the Treaty of Hudaybah and the Constitution of Medina, which all gives us indications how the Prophet was able to solve the problem when he was around. And then I'm going to come up with, there will be some investigation of the Khulafa if time is left, but if not, then I will skip that part and I will come with a proposal how they have, how the Islamic approach should be. There are no direct injunctions in the Quran on how to deal with conflict and conflict resolutions. But in many places in the Quran, there are references on how to resolve disputes between families, warring factions, and people at large. The Creator in the Quran orders the Muslim to arbitrate, mediate, and reconcile amongst the people, the believer and non-believer. In reference to the believers, it says the believers are but a single brotherhood. Now, believer means all who believe in God. It's not only referring to Muslims. So make peace and reconciliation between your two contending brothers, in fear Allah that you may receive mercy. And then between the believers and non-believers, it says, no good is there in much of their private conversation except for those who enjoy charity or that which is right or reconciliation between people. And whoever does that, seeking means to the approval of Allah, and we are going to give him a great reward. The primary objective of these references to establish peace, harmony, and justice through enforcement of law, providing security and defense of the people, property and territory, the guarantee of minimum standard of living, and the protection of life. A reference to the Quran again, it says, Allah does command you to render back your trust to those whom they are due, and when you judge between man and man, then judge with justice. Peace and security through arbitration or reconciliation strengthens the state, safeguards the people and their property, and protects the society with its values. In Islamic context, it is important that we talk about the values rather than the procedures, the structure, and the approaches that we do. Once conflict is resolved, the general welfare of the society will improve, basic needs of the people will be met, and justice will be implemented. As it's stated again in the Quran, O you who you believe, stand out firmly for Allah and witness to fair dealing, and let not the hatred of others to you make you swear to wrong and depart from justice. Now, from these and other Quranic injunctions, we can derive that the main tool of Islamic conflict resolution is arbitration, mediation, and reconciliation. As a well-established and widely used means to end disputes, arbitrations and mediations were common amongst the pre-Islamic Arabia. Ibn Ishaq reports to us when the tribe of Quraysh were in dispute about the black stone in Mecca. After Mecca was rebuilt, they were face to face and swore to the end that they will die, that who will be the first to place that black stone back into its place. Finally, after a long period of battle and discussion and struggle with them, they asked Muhammad, who was an outsider to the conflict, who was not a party to the conflict, to resolve their problems. What happened at that instance before Muhammad accepting this arbitration, he asked them that his decision will be final and nobody will oppose it. So I would come to that point later on. He then asked the people to bring a piece of cloth, put the stone in it, and asked the elders of the tribes to take the four corners of this cloth and move the stone to the designated place. And that way, the conflict was solved. Now, there were factors instrumental that the Quraysh accepted Muhammad's mission or mediation. First of all, the character of Muhammad played an important role. When we talk about an arbitrator, it is important who the arbitrator is, what are his credentials. The second element that played an important role was he was known as in Mecca and the surrounding area as a person of al-amin, a trustworthy, who could be trusted. The third element that added to this decision, that he was not party to the conflict. It is important that if we select a mediator, that they are not party to the conflict, like the Afghan Peace Council, which is created by President Karzai, and they want to establish peace in Afghanistan between the two warring factions. The third element that added to this decision was against the trust that the Quraysh family had in Muhammad himself. And as I said, when he was not a party, he was not part of the Banu Abd-Dar, the Banu Ka'b, and all of those people. And the final elements that added to the success of this arbitration was the agreement in advance that the people of Quraysh has agreed that they will accept his decision, whatever decision he makes. The Prophet himself not only acted as a mediator, but also encouraged his people to solve issues of conflict between other peoples. The Prophet himself even placed mediation and arbitration higher than praying, fasting, and almsgiving. On one occasion, the Prophet said to his people, "Shall I not inform you of something more excellent in degree than fasting, prayer, and almsgiving, or sadaqah?" The people replied, "Yes, Prophet of Allah." He said, "It is putting things right between people, mending discord, spoiling them in dishaver or in destructive." So much for the references to the Quran. And there are many more, but if I go over that, then it will take probably about 3 hours to finish it. Now, coming to the Constitution of Medina and the Treaty of Hudaybah, let me read something from that. The second example that conflict resolution can be extracted from Muhammad's migration to Medina is the issue of the treaty between the Jews, the Jewish tribe, and the constitution which has happened thereafter. Muhammad was invited as a mediator by 73 men and women of the Kharaj and Aus tribe of Medina who were at war with one another. And they were at the end of their strength. When he was invited, again, the people of Medina has given him the authority in advance to arbitrate between these tribes, and then his final decision will be implemented. In making his decision, Muhammad considered the traditional, social, cultural values of the people of Medina, who were divided by tribes, by lineages, by many other factors into the small, and then he divided these issues into small components. He didn't take it as a whole and made a decision, but he divided the issue of conflict into small components. He divided in the issue of the Banu Aus, of the Banu Harith, Banu Sayda. There are more Banus to come. There are about 10 or 12. I'm not going to read all of them. Muhammad's arbitration and the consequent treaty between the Muslims, the non-Muslims, and the Jews resulted in peace and unity between the Kharaj and the Aus tribe, and also between the Muslims and the Jews and the non-Muslims. The treaty changed the perception of the people of Medina in regards to power, the distribution of power, security, and protection, where before everything was based on family line, on tribal lines. The values were changed from family and tribes to religion, and to the unity and to the values of the revealed text. The security of God, this is the Article 18 of the Constitution of Medina, the security of God granted under this Constitution is one. The protection can be granted even by the humblest of the believers, that would be equally binding for all. So you can see that when this mediation took place, it not only established or solved the conflict, but also established a long-lasting structure that brought all the people together and ended the war at that period. A decisive factor here which led to the success of Muhammad in solving the dispute in Medina and the enacting of the Constitution of Medina was his decision-making basis on religious lines. In traditional Arab societies, affairs were conducted on tribal lines, and affiliation were more than often resulted in personal or tribal conflicts. It divided the communities and tribes along personal and tribal affiliation and interests and values. Muhammad used religious alignment where Jews among themselves and Jews within Muslims were able to find and recognize common interests and values, resulting in the unity of the people living in Medina. So the tool of conflict resolution was the revealed text, or the sacred value that Muhammad was able to bring people around that together. Article 3 of the Constitution of Medina states, the aforementioned communities shall formulate a constitutional unity as a distinct form of people. The right of all other Jews tribes were made equal to the right of the Banu Aus, the strongest and the most powerful and the biggest tribe of Medina at that time. It is interesting that the strongest tribe would be able to voluntarily give up these rights and be recognized as an equal partner. Consequently, his arbitration in the Constitution of Medina established rights and protection to every person living within the boundaries of the city of Medina, and a person seeking refuge in the city of Medina. Article 50 against refers to this protection. A person given constitutional shelter shall be granted an equal right of life and protection as long as he commits no harm and does not act treacherously. Negotiation does not always produce the desired outcome for all sides of the conflict. Sometimes taking a less favorable option can lead to a bigger gains in situation in the future. When we go back to the journey which Muhammad tried in 628 from Medina to Mecca, he was stopped at the vicinity of Hudaybah. Finally, after long negotiations back and forth, the Quraysh sent Suhail with the following proposal. Before reading this proposal, when they were negotiating, the Prophet has written, in the name of Allah, the most graceful, the most kind, how do we translate it? And the partner or the opposing party said, I do not recognize this entity as such. If I had, then there would be no conflict. So they had to cut the last part and say, in the name of God. And then said, Muhammad, the Prophet of God, again, he said, let's write Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. And he accepted that, even though his followers were not very happy about that. But he knew what he was doing. And when the treaty was drafted, it stated that Muhammad should return back to Mecca, but he could come after 1 year with his people, no arms, only one sword that will be also hidden, nothing else. If a person from the Quraysh seeks refuge with Muhammad, then he shall be returned. But if a Muslim seeks refuge with the Quraysh, then the Quraysh are not obligated to return. So if you can see this, this treaty is not in the interest of the Muslim people at that time. But Muhammad saw gain and peace for his people at that time. So again, sometimes accepting lesser values of negotiation is beneficial than not accepting it. In today's negotiations, unfortunately, every party is trying to gain the most or even at a zero-sum game. We hear in the Syrian crisis that President Assad should resign and leave, even though he's a brutal man. But you have to understand the values, the cultures, the honor, whatever goes with this whole bargaining system. One has to recognize that and then come up with a peace proposal and say if it's working or not working. Or in the case of Afghanistan, when we say the Taliban should lay down their weapon and then they can negotiate. If they lay down their weapon, there is no war. So there will be no need for negotiation. You have to negotiate with someone who is armed. And then negotiations takes place. Now, what is the approach? How do we come up and say, well, what's the Islamic approach? The Islamic approach to conflict resolution, again, which is derived from the Quranic injunction, the prophetic hadith, by a qualified person who is allowed to use his reasoning in hikmah, wisdom. It is not only the issue of on hand, or the structure itself, or the elements itself that has to be decided, or how it's supposed to be divided. In Islamic conflict resolution, the important thing is, what is this leading to? What is the result of this decision or conflict negotiation? Is it leading to a society that will have a venue for reconciliation, that the society could live together and build on that, and that this problem will be permanently solved? Or is the issue just on hand and it's solve it temporarily, where the main issues are not touched and this conflict can rise again? In Islam, the issue is that you have to investigate what has really caused this, and when making a decision on that, then those principles, elements have to be resolved, not the over the surface negotiation has to end successfully. The arbitrator or the mediator arrives at a decision after examining the local social, cultural, and political context. Without understanding the local, social, and cultural and political context, no negotiation will be successful. We have seen what has happened in the past in several places that has been not successful because the local issues were not investigated properly. It is also important that the individual components of history of conflict are investigated, and the customs and the norms of the communities are understood before arriving at a decision. The purpose of the final decision is not only to solve the dispute on hand, but also to bring istislah. Istislah refers to a situation where the best interest of the community, of the society, and of the individuals are considered. Not only one, all of them together. And which leads also to long-lasting or forever-lasting peace. The purpose of the final where was I? Okay. Therefore, the Islamic approach to conflict resolution is based on rights and responsibilities, rather than issues, variables, and mechanism. In Islam, there are no rights without responsibilities. When you are given a right, at the same time you have certain responsibility to fulfill in order to be entitled for that right. And when you're making an arbitration in Islamic context, then those have to be combined together. Rights and responsibility in Islamic context are both personal and communal. Individual autonomy and individual rights do exist, but they are subservient when it comes to the community and the society. Therefore, group identity and religious principle and the requirements are important factors allowing sustained conflict resolution. Both the religious values and the social norms, such as codes of honors, shame, and dignity, become the dominant factors in solving the conflict. Social and cultural norms within the context of the Islamic principles I've been suffering from cold for the past month. I will tell you the story about that one also. Those are all becoming important before a mediation takes place. Social and cultural norms forces individuals in communities to accept responsibilities both at the personal and collective levels and make venue for restorative justice. Thank you, appreciate that. In the early Islamic period, when Prophet Muhammad was asked to arbitrate between the Jewish factions, he combined the notion of the Arab customary law or urf with the principles of Judaism and Islam to achieve and create a cohesive mechanism which brought the different tribes together and unified them in one community. If he had worked only on the Islamic principles at that point, it would have not worked for the Jewish community because the Jewish communities were not Muslims. So he have combined And if he has only worked for the Jewish religious values, then will have worked for the Muslim community. So he has to combine both the Jewish values, the Muslim values, and the custom of the people of Medina in order to arrive at the decision that has united the community in Medina. To end it, I would say that Islamic approach to conflict resolution, the arbitrators and the mediators' personality, social status, credibility are important factors for success. It is important that the person is of an age, meaning usually is an older age, is considered to be a wise man in those traditions. You cannot send somebody young like me, so you have to send an older person. Usually people, the religious, political and military powers in affiliations of the mediators are important. What political status he has, what military status he has, what financial status he has, those are all important factors in that. An Islamic approach to conflict resolution is not about the immediate procedures in structure of conflict, of solving a conflict at the point, but also is more about the rights and responsibilities leading to reconciliation, which it means leading to a concept of just social order. When we talk about Islamic approach to conflict resolution, we have to consider all the elements that are affecting the initiations of the conflict, be that economic disparities, social disparities, political disparities, the cultural contractions, the social contractions between the people, the initiations of the animosity, how it has become, all those have to be included to proceed. Now, this model is mainly designed for the Muslim countries and Muslim societies. It may work for other religious societies if they would follow their own principles. It may work for them, but this is mainly directed at an idea of conflict solution within the territory of Islam. Thank you very much. That's all.
I think somehow I ended up with your cold. Thank you so much. I forgot to mention at the outset, as we did this morning, the two speakers will join us up here, and there'll be time for Q&A, as you can guess. Certainly, Professor Momand had much more to share with us than he had time to do, and so there may be some time to unpack some of that in the Q&A. Our next presenter is Douglas Johnson from the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. I had a chance, maybe some of you have as well, to get a look at least the table of contents of his book, of his latest book, and it looks quite remarkable. We began a conversation, but that's all we had time to do, so there may be time after the presentation to pursue some of it. Douglas Johnson's address, as you can tell from the program, is Faith-Based Diplomacy, an asymmetric counter to the asymmetric threat. That's Johnson.
Thank you, Leonard. It's indeed a privilege to follow Professor Momand up here. And it's indeed a privilege just to address you. I've been to Salt Lake City a few times, and I've heard about the Tanner annual event, and it's just a privilege to be here. I'd like to thank Brian Farr for helping precipitate my attendance and all that Victoria and Alita have done to make this thing work. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this business called faith-based diplomacy, but let me give you a little bit of a strategic background first. For about 25 years now, Pentagon planners have been wrestling with the challenges of what's called the asymmetric threat. And for those of you who are not familiar with that term, what it really usually means is an attack by creative, unconventional means that a disadvantaged opponent uses against a more powerful adversary, much like bin Laden did to rock this country back on its heels on 9/11. And in response to that, they came up with a new concept called irregular warfare, which calls for a much tighter integration of defense, diplomacy, and development, which is all to the good. But when you think about it, there's just simply not enough money in Western treasuries to protect any country from the full spectrum of possible asymmetric threats. So I think you really need is an asymmetric counter to that asymmetric threat, hence the title of the talk. Now that and that means getting at the ideas behind the guns, not dealing with the guns themselves so much as dealing with the ideas behind the guns, which sounds reasonably straightforward, but it's made more complicated by the religious nature of those ideas. And that's not good for the United States because, as has been amply evident from our interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, we have very little capability to deal with religious differences in a hostile setting, nor do we have any ability to counter demagogues like bin Laden or before him Milosevic, who manipulate religion for their own purposes. And I find it supremely ironic that here we are, one of the most religious countries on the face of the planet, and we're so unable to deal with these religious imperatives that permeate the geopolitical landscape. There are a number of reasons for that, several that stand out. First is that we've unfortunately used our separation of church and state as an excuse for not doing our homework to understand how religion informs the worldviews and political aspirations of others who do not similarly separate the two. Secondly, we have been long committed to the rational actor model of decision making, which has governed our practice of international relations for as long as I can remember. But this is a model in which non-rational factors like religion are excluded. So, you know, our policymakers just not been on their screens. We simply don't know how to deal with it. And finally, again, to separation of church and state, the political ambiguity surrounding our separation causes many of our political leaders and military leaders to shy away from dealing with the religious dimensions of the threats that they're facing. So we're really out there operating with one hand tied behind our back. When you marry all this to this looming specter of religious extremism married to weapons of mass destruction, you know, it just makes more urgent the need to fill this gap. Well, one approach that has shown unusual promise in doing that is this business called faith-based diplomacy. Now, what do I mean by that? At the macro level, it simply means including religious considerations into the practice of international politics. At the micro level, it means actually making religion part of the solution in some of these intractable identity-based conflicts, I mean ethnic, tribal, religious hostilities that exceed the grasp of traditional diplomacy. And if you want to get into it in greater depth, I would refer you to the book that Leonard mentioned called Religion, Terror, and Error. And it's a how-to book. It's how to incorporate religious considerations into the practice of U.S. foreign policy. It's how to move beyond the rational actor model to a process that accommodates non-state actors and non-rational factors like religion. And it's also a how-to book to move to a new leadership paradigm for the United States that will serve us better in the multipolar world that awaits us. And if I had to give that a bumper sticker characterization, I would say servant leadership at the international level, where you lead more by example than by force. And I'd just like to read to you from the foreword by General Anthony Zinni, who was used to be, he's a retired four-star Marine general who was in charge of Central Command, which conducts our wars in that area. And he also was former U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East. But here's what he said. He said, "This is a visionary approach that goes beyond the whole of government effort and which expands the current definition of smart power. From my 2 decades of experience in the Islamic world, I am convinced that the vast majority of Muslims would embrace this approach as a means of clearly expressing their beliefs and enabling them to understand ours. So the book, I've got permission to shamelessly promote the book, and if you like, you can buy one afterwards. We sell them at author's discount, exactly what it costs us, because the Amazon and the publisher charge too much. But we also have a sign-up sheet in the back in case you would like to be put on our newsletter list, which costs you nothing, but once a month it captures the more exciting elements of what we do. So that's for that. And the book actually won the Book of the Year award from Forward Reviews, which is the rating agency for all independent publishers in the universities. So anyway, enough of that. What I'd like to do now is just tell you a little bit about our center. Since its inception in 1999, we've been practicing this faith-based diplomacy in different parts of the world. We started in the north of Sudan, to Kashmir, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. And just to illustrate a little bit of what this diplomacy looks like, I'll just tell you about our work in Pakistan. Now, for 7 years, we were on the ground there reforming the madrasas, the religious schools, including the ones that gave birth to the Taliban. And very few of us in the West are mindful of the illustrious history of these schools. If you read about them in the news media, all you get is the impression these are seedbeds of terrorism with a caveman-like mentality, and that's simply not the case. But back in the Middle Ages through the 16th century, they were without peer as institutions of higher learning in the world at the time. It was European exposure to them that led to our own university system in the West. And you would be shocked at how many of the traditions and mores of academe trace their roots back to the madrasas. The mortar boards and tassels you wear at graduation, funding a chair in a given discipline. Shouldn't be any surprise because they were the model, but we've just forgotten that. So under the impact of British colonialism and fearful of losing their Muslim identity, they purged themselves of all disciplines that they considered to be either Western or secular in nature, to the point where the vast majority of them today are about rote memorization of the Quran and the study of Islamic principles. Our goals there were twofold. First was to expand the curriculums to include the physical and social sciences with a very strong emphasis on human rights, particularly women's rights, and religious tolerance. And then secondly, to transform the pedagogy to create critical thinking skills among the youth. Why that's so important is these youngsters may graduate from the madrasa and have memorized the Quran from cover to cover, and you get an honorary title in front of your name that means good things for you and your family in paradise afterwards. Hafiz is the title. But along comes the local militant to recruit them into the cause, and these kids have no ability to question or challenge because, first of all, they don't know what they memorized. They're having to memorize it in Arabic, and their first language is Urdu, and they don't get sufficient Arabic till way later on to understand something as sophisticated as the Quran. So that's why it's important. Now, over those 7 years, we engaged some 2,700 madrasa leaders from 1,600 madrasas. Sounds like a lot. It's not. There's 20,000. But all of these were in the very radical areas, and we are very convinced that there's enough momentum to take this across the entire country at this point. Now, to bring it alive for you, I'll share just a couple of anecdotes with you. And there are countless anecdotes, believe me. In one of our workshops, one of the attendees was a Taliban commander of some renown. He was despondent because he'd lost 2 sons in the fighting. And he said, we don't know what America wants. You come after us with guns, we've got no recourse but to respond in kind. So this then led to an invitation for me to come to the mountains to meet with their senior leadership, tell them what America wants. And that happened 2 months later, and in the meantime, I went around to State, Defense, and CIA to make sure whatever I said was consistent with U.S. policy. And I'm here to tell you it's not only the Afghans in the mountains that don't know what America wants. But this took place in the Malakand Agency, which is the northwest frontier of Pakistan, up in the mountains. It's right across from the Afghan province of Nuristan. And most all of these were Afghan Taliban commanders. But I walk into the room, there's 57 Taliban commanders, several tribal and religious leaders. And I told them, I said, look, we're not a government organization, nor have we received any funding from our government, which was true at that point in time. I said, but and if our government had its way, this meeting would never take place. I said, but what I'm interested in doing is to see if we can build upon commonly shared religious values to create a confidence-building measure that can point toward peace. I said, but for you to engage in this exercise, you need to understand the Western perspective. So I told them very briefly what America wanted, which simply put was to lay down their arms, distance themselves from al-Qaeda, and to reconcile with the Karzai government. And then we went into about 2.5 hours of dialogue, a lot of venting going on. It was clear by the looks on some folks' faces that they were less pleased to be there than others. And I found out later, didn't know then, I'm glad I didn't, that some of them were al-Qaeda. But there were a number of penetrating questions that emerged, and just three to give you a feel for it. They wanted to know what the American people wanted. And with that, I breathed a sigh of relief, because that meant they were still cutting us some slack, even though we'd re-elected the administration that was the source of their grief. So I told them what America wanted was peace in the region with democratically stable governments in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they wanted to know why we were attacking Islam. And I said the U.S. was not attacking Islam, as should be apparent from past interventions on behalf of Muslims in Bosnia, Kosovo, Somalia, Kuwait. I said left untold in most renditions of Somalia are the more than 100,000 Somali lives that were saved as a result of the humanitarian aspects of that intervention. And I said, and then they wanted to know why we're attacking Afghanistan. I said, well, to put it in terms you hold dear, which are hospitality, loyalty, and revenge, before we recognized certain members of al-Qaeda as a threat, we welcomed them to our country. We gave them hospitality. Then they struck without warning on 9/11. We wanted revenge, so we went to the Taliban government to turn over al-Qaeda leadership for justice. They refused, so we attacked. But I said we did so with a heavy heart, because most Americans have great admiration and respect for the Afghan people stemming from our common struggle against the former Soviet Union. And furthermore, it's important to recognize that some of your tribal leaders are now banding together because al-Qaeda has violated your hospitality. So anyway, this went on for 2.5 hours. Then we broke for prayer, came back in a small group, and put together a small confidence-building measure. But one little episode during that 2.5 hours of venting was at one point, a very tough-looking gentleman stood up and pointed his finger at me and said, I can't talk to you unless you become a Muslim. And I said, well, I don't see a problem. I said, Muslim means submission to God. We all submit to God, therefore we're all Muslims. So everybody laughed and we went on with our business. But our project director and our Wahhabi indigenous partner, who had spent the better part of a month rounding these folks up, they got very uptight because the scenario is you convert or you die. And I was totally oblivious to that, of course, and I thought to myself, you know, the Lord really does look out for fools and incompetents. But that confidence-building measure failed because I couldn't get NATO to buy in on what they had to do. But 3 months later, it paid off because the Korean ambassador to the U.S. called me and asked if there was anything we could do to rescue the 21 missionaries that were being held hostage by the Taliban. And because of the networking out of that earlier meeting in the mountains, we were able to play an instrumental role in getting them released. So you never know where the payoff's going to come. One last very brief anecdote. You'll recall when the Taliban had taken over the Swat Valley, which is sort of a resort area in the north of Pakistan. And we were having a workshop for 16 madrasas surrounding the Swat Valley at the time. And toward the end of the meeting, one gentleman stood up. He was a madrasa leader, but he was also a commander in Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is the terrorist group that brought you Mumbai. And he said, I came here for one reason and one reason only. It's to discredit everything you have to say. He says, but I now find myself standing here full of rage. Rage because for 26 years I've studied and taught the Quran the way it was taught to me. He says, after today, for the first time in my life, I feel I've experienced the soul of the Holy Quran and its peaceful intent. He says, I now see that the right way to advance Islam is through peace, not through conflict. I'm going to change what I tell my students, and I'm going to tell them why. That's a very, very bold thing for him to say in that context. He may got cut some slack because he was a terrorist commander, but your heads roll for a lot less in that area. Anyway, we came back a month later, and sure enough, he was doing exactly as he said. And we had a CNN team with us. They'd been after us for several years to document our work, and he said it on CNN for God and the entire world to hear. So those are the anecdotes. Systemically, we took the top leadership group of all the madrasas to Turkey and Egypt to see how they handle Islamic education. And they went with an attitude. They said, what can these seculars teach us religious purists? They came back very humbled because they found that not only could Turkish and Egyptian students handle religious questions every bit as capably as any Pakistani madrasa student, but they could also handle contemporary problems because they'd had all the other courses that are necessary. So they came back and said, from now on, we're going to require certification of madrasa faculty. Up to that time, there had been no standards. And so we've got 5 universities that are now training madrasa faculty. So it's really turning out well. And I'll end on one last note here. One day I sat down with our project director, who deserves the lion's share of the credit for our accomplishments there. I said, from this day forward, I don't ever want to mention our center's name in Pakistan again. I said, we're too widely known and we're too targeted. And 3 days later, I couldn't believe the timing, but there came out a 7-page online jihadist journal article, went to all the cells in Pakistan and Afghanistan, specifically targeting our work. So the good news is we were having an impact. The bad news, we were having an impact. So fortunately, 2 years earlier, we'd put in place the legal framework for an indigenous NGO that we would one day staff up and pass the baton to, because our job is always to work ourselves out of a job by creating capacity, not dependency. So we did that. We took our project director, let him go. He became the president of it. Got the State Department, who had opposed our work for 5 years, still don't know why, but they finally came forward with $500,000 funding to support the project work, because they finally saw that what we were doing with the madrasas was every bit as strategic as anything else that was taking place on or off the battlefield. And frankly, if you want to drain the swamp of extremism, the bombs and the bullets don't do it. They just beget more terrorists. But if you can win hearts and minds, and they can win others, that's the way you get there. I think I better stop now. I've exceeded my time, but I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, we have our full 20 minutes. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, yes. Would you like some water? Get some. Here, let me get it for you. Well, questions? Dean.
I have one question for Abdul Muhammad and another, and one for Douglas Johnston. So first, Abdul, with you. The conflict resolution and reconciliation, the Islamic concept of that you just mentioned in your talk, based on the Holy Quran and the Prophet's ideas, it seemed like you emphasized the communal and the tribal aspect of it, the time when it evolved, and it was more a communal approach. My question then is, when it comes to rights, you mentioned that a lot, rights with responsibilities. When it comes to rights for the individuals, which are often supposed to be universal rather than communal. How is that reconciled within that communal frame, in that Islamic framework? That's my one question. And then maybe I might as well put this other question, and we'll hear the response after you. Doug Johnston, wonderful talk, loved it, but I just have one comment about your title, an asymmetric counter to the asymmetric threat. And you said that because of this asymmetry that we find with the weapons of mass destruction, and that was launched in a way that is not consistent with the just war doctrine, and it was aimed at the civilians, which is, of course, the asymmetric idea in warfare. We have to resort to something not by force, but in a similar asymmetric way to go beyond violence to respond to that. But I was wondering, those who launched that, not that I'm defending them, of course, but they might say that by putting it this way, we do not quite understand their initial reservation or concern, which is that the system is asymmetric to start with against them. And that's perhaps the only way that they can inflict any harm in response to this massive and systemic harm that has been waged against them. So I would like to see how, from your faith-based approach, you would like to respond to that concern, which seems to be their main concern that leads to their sense of violence toward the parties that had been perpetrating this violence to them. So these are my two questions.
But they're so easy.
When you refer to right being universal, that's correct in the Western context. But when we talk about rights in Islamic context, even though there are individual rights, as I stated before, but when it comes to the issue of society, there are restrictions on individuals. And then the rights of the society take precedence over the right of the individual people. You can see this in terms of democracy. When you have an issue on hand and there are majority and minority, the majority rules over the minority. In the decision of the minority, or majorities are accepted even though the minority will not like this decision, maybe on not their interest, but they still have to accept it. It's the same thing in the issue of personal rights and social rights in the Muslim society. The right of the Muslim society are given more weight, even though it doesn't mean that individual rights are undermined. The individual rights are considered, but if that individual right happens to be not in accordance with the social values of the society or the social norms, then that could be given lesser weight than it's comparing to the Western universal context.
Yeah, I would just, can you hear me? Yeah. I would just add to what he said there, just to illustrate it for you. In one of our workshops, one of the imams came up afterwards, a madrasa leader, and he said, you know, there's a situation in our village that in which a young lady was caught talking on her cell phone at 2 o'clock in the morning to a young man in another village in whom she had an interest, and the village elders felt that this was a violation of their code of honor, and so she was to die and the boy was to lose his nose and his ears. And he said, ordinarily I would not intervene in something like this because it happens all the time. He says, but after our discussions on human rights, I now feel compelled to go back and challenge this on religious grounds. And he was a fairly young man, so it was with some trepidation that he did that, but he went and challenged the village elders, pointing out in the Holy Quran there was nothing that forbade a woman from talking to a man, and he also urged the passages that encourage peaceful resolution of differences, and he pulled it off. Nobody was harmed, and hopefully that's a precedent for that village and maybe others to come. But this is a case where, in a context where tribalism and Islam are so intermingled. It's very difficult even for a Muslim to tell you where one ends and the other begins. You know, but so much of the more onerous aspects that are attributed to Islam these days are really more tribal than they are religious. And so that's a case where, and it's not a given that religion's always going to trump, because as they'll point out to you, our tribal customs date back 3,000 years, and Islam's only 1,400. So you have to work at it. As to your other question, which is a very good question, it's never had it before, but when you think in the big picture, history is full of asymmetric warfare. I mean, the disadvantaged opponent will always figure out some way to get at the more powerful oppressor, if you will. In our own case, for us to pretend to turn this Goliath called the United States of America around is like trying to turn an aircraft carrier. It's very slow. One note of encouragement, we've been working with the opposition leaders in Syria at their request to help them reconcile their differences. And we use faith-based reconciliation seminars, which is a seminar that lasts about 3.5 days, and it goes very deep into one's attitudes and perceptions. And what we're really trying to do is bring the transcendent aspects of people's personal religious faith to bear in overcoming the secular obstacles to peace. And I have never seen one of these take place without it at the end ending up with people embracing one another and in tears. I mean, it hits hearts as well as minds, and I'm talking about some pretty tough adversaries coming in. We've been doing that, and we've done 5 of those, and the last 3 have been funded by the State Department. Okay, that's amazing. For the State Department's probably the most secular operation you're ever going to find in your life, and even they are now starting to wake up to, you know, trying to tap into religious faith in a positive way to see if there's not a way to bridge differences between adversaries, if you will. So that's an attempt at an answer, but it's certainly not exactly what you were looking for. But
hi. Hello. I was wondering for Professor Mohmand, you mentioned that one element of this, the role of arbitrator, is that the person fulfilling that role should be a non-party to the conflict. And I wonder, with some of the most high-profile conflicts that involve Islamic countries, I wonder if it's reasonable to expect anyone in the world to claim the role of non-party to that conflict. For example, the issue of nuclear non-proliferation in Iran, the entire world is implicated by that conflict. And so I wonder how we can find legitimate arbitrators in conflicts where everyone has something at stake. And then I also wondered for Douglas Johnston, how, kind of in that same mode of the role of arbitrator, how do you find individuals who have the status, the position, the legitimacy, the credentials to be taken seriously in kind of mediating and re-articulating the vision in the Quran in these seminars and in these madrasa programs?
I think you need either to go to the Horn of Africa or to the mountain of Afghanistan to bring somebody who doesn't know about the nuclear proliferation problems. I think this idea of non-partisanship, it can still work because there are really certain people in the different part of the world. They may not be high diplomats, they may not be foreign ministers, they may not be presidents of this or that. Usually when we see the arbitrators or the negotiators in the nuclear non-proliferation or other issues, they're mainly diplomats. And diplomats are trained, as we heard yesterday, to do diplomacy. And not really investigate the issues. Probably you still could find people around the world, and I'm sure in many parts of the world that there are honest people who really wants to negotiate issues and really wants to solve the conflict. We just need to make the effort. We don't have to have a person of high profile. You can really find somebody, a humble person, and that's, we give an example in the case of Afghanistan that may help to understand about the nuclear non-proliferation issue with Iran. The conflict has been going on, and Afghanistan wants to negotiate with the Taliban. Taliban wants to negotiate with America, and America is not interested in negotiating with the Taliban. So this is the problem. They do not talk to one another. I wrote a paper which is supposed to have been published about 2 months ago. It's called Negotiations or Negotiations, the Obstacles for creating a dialogue between the Taliban and the United States. Is that the so-called peace council that has been created by President Karzai is actually people who are either part of the government or part of the structure, or people who are trusted by those. Where in Afghanistan we have people who have not been involved in the party, who are elders of the town, who are elders of the community, who are either religious scholars, and they are willing to arbitrate, they are willing to negotiate and solve this problem. When 9/11 happened, I was in Utah then, but I come from California, and well, originally I'm from Afghanistan, but then I was, after finishing my work at UCLA, then I stayed there. About 23 Afghans who are either teachers, engineers, professionals, we wrote a letter to the Secretary of State then to give us a chance to go to Afghanistan and negotiate, and we cannot guarantee you, but about 80% we would have a chance to hand over bin Laden to you. There are other ways. We may not be handing it over to you, but we may be able to get rid of him, meaning that Afghans have this tradition not to hand over their guest, but he could be shot by somebody, you know, from the mountain. He lives in the mountain, and that solves the problem. When you get rid of him, and that was my solution, actually. I didn't say it that way, but I wanted to go to the Taliban and tell them, just kill him. You know, and somebody would have shot him, and then we had the problem solved. But the United States government was not interested in listening to us and giving us an opportunity to mediate or negotiate this issue for them. So you can find people and then who are nonpartisan, who have no interest in these things, and they could really be nonpartisan and honest arbitrator in these issues. But then again, you have to really tell them in advance, well, we ask you, but when you make a decision, the decision will be an informed decision, but we will accept it.
Yes, and in response to your other question, I would just say every conflict in the world is unique. They're driven by personalities and circumstances. They're all different. There are very few of the conflicts have we found ourselves in a mediating role, if you, as you would. We try to do whatever strategic that's going to move the ball forward. And whenever we go into a place, we will team up with an indigenous NGO that already commands the respect and has credibility with the people that we're interested in reaching, so we're not starting from scratch, if you will. Just to give you an example on this business of the trying to reconcile differences between the Syrian opposition leaders, after we take them through this reconciliation seminar, then we take them into a problem-solving session. And you know, and part of all this, for example, at one point they have to go out and make a list of all the grievances that they have at the hands of the other party there at this session. And then they also have to make a list of how they have offended the other parties, you know, and they're trying to get at the wounds of history, if you will. That's something that wasn't mentioned in earlier sessions today. By the way, I thought those were very rich sessions, but wounds of history last for so long unless you figure out how to break them. The only way to break the cycle of revenge on that is through forgiveness. And it's a much more sophisticated concept than it sounds on the merits, but we're very big into that. But in this problem-solving business, after you've achieved this degree of reconciliation, it's just a matter of guiding the discussion and them coming up with the solutions. And out of the, I think it was 2 seminars ago, we came up with a social contract between the Kurds and the Syriac Christians in eastern Syria, Al-Hasaq region. And this social contract will enable them to actually live in peace once the fighting subsides. And there's never been anything like that. There's just been animosity in the past. So we're very opportunistic, okay? The lion's share of the credit in Pakistan goes to the fact I hired a fellow who's a Pakistani American. He was, of all things, he was a diversity trainer at AARP. Well, turns out, I felt like this was divine intervention because this gentleman spent his youth in Karachi, attended a madrasa himself, best trainer I've ever seen in my life, one of the most likable people on the face of the planet. And that combination has just been like a hot knife cutting through butter in terms of, we had one situation where one of the madrasa leaders came specifically to assassinate him. If he detected any kind of American agenda, he was going to do that. But he said all he heard was being encouraged to become a better Muslim and talking about that in depth. And this guy became a huge champion. And that's one of the things that's bowled me over on all this business is once you penetrate that veneer of rage and hostility, not only do these folks get it, but many of them become champions of what you're talking about at great personal risk to themselves, and they infect others. So,
which is not related to the question directly, but just it may clarify certain issues. I mean, most of the time we have misperceptions about people, what they think and what they do, and that's response to the may relate to the madrasa, our understanding of madrasas and of the people who were involved in those madrasas. I came from Afghanistan about a month ago. That's why I have the cold, thanks to them. People think that the bullets or bombs may kill you, but the weather is enough. The air in Kabul is enough to kill you. So I was surprised when I visited a university created by the Taliban. A full-fledged university teaching people after finishing high school. They have separate places for men and women. This is the culture, accepted. They have schools from 1st grade to 12th grade, both for girls and boys, created in the city of Kabul. So, we just need to find people and how to talk to them. When we know the ways how to talk to people, we can negotiate very easily. What we do most of the time, talk over the head of the people, talk other issues that are not even important. And that's why a negotiator, an honest negotiator or mediator becomes important, that person can really touch and go and touch the basis of the problem.
Let's take one more question. Francis.
Interesting talks. My question's to Douglas. I wondered about, you mentioned once or twice that you did or didn't get money from the State Department. I wondered whether that wouldn't weaken your position. I'd assumed that you would be quite independent and people would think it was an American agenda.
No, it's a very good point. And in fact, we didn't get any funding till very recently, but long ago we had the heads of the sects that sponsor the madrasas come up to us and tell us, we don't know where you get your funding and we don't care. We just want what you're, So we'd kind of, over a period of time, had earned credibility and trust. And the State Department is easier to sell than the Defense Department or CIA, for example. But you're right. It's sensitive, but NGOs are wonderful. NGOs, you can do the right thing for the right reason at the right time, but you also have to raise the funds to be able to do it, And typically, you're always hanging by your fingernails financially, So when state got on board for the right reasons, it's an opportunity to sort of show the better face of America too. So we don't miss those opportunities.
Well, we're out of time. I want to thank both of these illustrious gentlemen for their wisdom, for your questions.